Allison. The Cowboys season is over. Their resume is in for those bowl selection committees, and it looks as though they're likely headed either to the Alamo Bowl or the Russell Athletic Bowl. Kyle Fredrickson joins us on the phone, though, to discuss this. Kyle, there's still a little bit of drama left for the Cowboys, even though they're not playing this week. Baylor hosts Texas, and that's a game that could potentially have some ramifications when it comes to bowl selections. How does that all work?
Yeah, it's an interesting system because obviously the Big 12 comes out with their one true champion mantra, and then last year we ended up having two true champions. So there's some different things in place to make sure that these ties don't happen. And in OSU's case, here's how it works. They got three teams all tied with two losses at this point, with OSU, Baylor, and TCU. But like you mentioned, that Baylor-Texas outcome would break that stalemate should the Baylor go ahead and lose at home to Texas, which seems unlikely. That would send OSU to the Sugar Bowl, possibly against a pretty high-caliber SEC opponent. But considering that that's a pretty unlikely scenario, what's most likely going to happen here is the Big 12 is going to go to its tiebreaker policy to establish who that number 2 team is in the Big 12. So what they go off of is point differential in the matchups that these teams have faced each other. And it turns out the Cowboys fare the best. Between their games against Baylor and TCU, they come out at a +10. Baylor comes out at a +3. And TCU comes out at -13. So OSU fans might see that and think, oh, great, we're the number 2 team. But with how the protocol works is the point differential, all it does is eliminate the lowest contender, that being TCU. And then when you go to head-to-head matchups, Baylor then has the edge over the Cowboys for that second spot, despite the fact that the Cowboys have the best overall point differential. So it's a little bit confusing. I had to get out the calculator to make sure I had everything right, kind of tallying it all up. But it turns out that the Cowboys are in a bit of between a rock and a hard place in terms of where they're going to go. And now it's up to the Alamo Bowl committee to decide who they want, Texas Christian or Oklahoma State. It'll be interesting to see who they go with.
Welcome to the new math of the Big 12, I guess. I'm surprised you didn't have to get on an abacus and do some sort of high-level calculation there, Kyle. You're right, it is a little confusing. But obviously, Cowboy fans should be watching to see if maybe Texas can pull that upset. It would be a huge upset in Waco because you have no doubt that the Baylor fans are going to be excited to be able to beat that burnt orange down there in Waco on Saturday. But like you said, Kyle, that probably opens the door to Alamo or Russell Athletic. Alamo Bowl being down in San Antonio on January 2nd. Russell Athletic being in Orlando on, I believe, December 29th. Yeah, December 29th, so an earlier bowl there. But, Kyle, both of these bowls have some knowledge of Oklahoma, state of Oklahoma teams. Is there an indication of maybe which way they might go? Alamo would get the first choice. Would they take the Cowboys if they did have that option?
Yeah, it's a good question because, there was a bowl representative who spoke with the Seattle Times on Saturday, and it's part of my story I wrote, talking about the things that they look at. And one thing that should make OSU fans optimistic that the Alamo Bowl might choose them was, how well does the team travel and kind of what's the general overall attitude of the fans. TCU certainly has a pretty rabid fan base, and they've done very well this year. But, just to see the turnout for Bedlam despite the chilly conditions, the history of this fan base going down to San Antonio in 2010 when the Cowboys beat, Nick Foles-led Arizona 36-10, and that Alamo Bowl victory, they're well aware of how good this fan base is. But, just with how TCU's season ended and how OSU's regular season ended, the Horned Frogs now sit above OSU in both the AP and the coaches poll. And you wonder if maybe that Alamo Bowl committee takes a bit more stock in those polls than some strange, rules that the Big 12 has in determining, placement within the conference. So there's going to be a lot of different things at play, and OSU fans, even if, this team doesn't go to the Alamo Bowl, the Russell Athletic Bowl is still a pretty good consolation prize because, if North Carolina ends up losing to Clemson in the ACC championship game, there's a good chance that would be the ACC opponent. And, of course, with Larry Fedora coaching that team, there'd definitely be some fun storylines, at least for us to cover in the lead up to what would be a pretty good game.
Yeah, something to remember about these bowls. They have a couple teams to choose from, and selling tickets is one of their top priorities when it comes to their selection. So I know the Alamo Bowl, they've not had TCU there, so does that maybe make them more attractive to the Alamo Bowl? We'll have to see. You mentioned, Kyle, the 2010 Alamo Bowl, which was really greatly attended by Oklahoma State fans. So I have to think the Alamo Bowl thinks about that. And then you have to think, too, Kyle, lastly, about what kind of team is going to be on the field. Trevon Boykin was hurt, but then he returned. So TCU has that high-powered offense seemingly going for bowl season. But the question now, is Mason Rudolph available for the Cowboys? How does that play into things? I know the Alamo Bowl likes high-scoring games. Could that potentially be a factor for the Alamo Bowl? Is there any way to know at this point, I guess?
Yeah, I was actually, right before this call, I was hoping that Mike Gundy would be on the Big 12 coaches teleconference so we could get a bit of an update on that. But it turns out that they're only featuring the coaches who are playing games this weekend. So we'll just kind of have to wait and find out with Rudolph's status. But you're right. That's something they're going to take into consideration because, like you said, this is a game we know where the Alamo Bowl has their first pick of Pac-12 and Big 12 teams for this bowl. They want to make sure that they have not only the best teams but the best matchup. And I think from a national audience's perspective, Trevon Boykin against potentially another high-flying offense in Oregon might seem a little bit better than this OSU team, given the issues that it's had to move football the past 2 weeks, despite the fact that they've really had a magical season up to this point. So there's a lot of factors that are going to go into it. I'm not so sure that, once your team is outside of that New Year's Six or playoff talk, that a lot of these bowls are all that much different in the fans' eyes. But like you had mentioned, back in 2010, there was a very large contingent of OSU fans on that Alamo Bowl game. I'm sure they'd do the same, should they draw that card. And it might be a little bit more difficult for those fans to get all the way out to Orlando, for a game against North Carolina potentially. So lots to shake out. We'll definitely keep an eye on college football this weekend and kind of see where it goes from there. That's
definitely right. We'll know more about bowl destinations by the end of this weekend. So be sure to stay with the best coverage team anywhere at newsok.com and every day in the Oklahoman.